I'd like to thank the members of the Academy for honoring my fellow nominees and myself. This means a lot to me, since it comes from a role in which I was directed by my father. Anjelica Huston was admired as a symbol of strength and elegance. I don't want to be an example to anyone who you know, who doesn't know their own mind yet. What lived underneath that image was something else entirely. A father who controlled her with one hand and destroyed her with the other. A career built inside an industry that told her she wasn't beautiful enough or lovable enough to deserve the room she was standing in. A diagnosis that quietly ended her dream of becoming a mother. And one night in 1986, on the biggest night of her career, Oprah Winfrey did something so deliberate and so cold that Anjelica walked out of that party and never spoke about it publicly for nearly 40 years. At 74, she sat down and finally exposed everything she was never supposed to say. The lonely childhood. Long before Anjelica opened up that bitter encounter with Oprah on Oscar night opened wounds from her childhood that she had spent a lifetime trying to bury. Anjelica had been born in Santa Monica on July 8, 1951, into a home where her father, John Huston, was gone most of the year. Film sets, distant locations and long shoots took priority, and she grew up watching him come and go without much explanation. When she was 7, he took her to one of his film premieres. Assistants crowded him the moment they arrived, pulling him toward the entrance and lining up photographers. He leaned down and told her he would be back in a few minutes and to stay where she was. Something in his eyes made her pause. It felt careless, like he was already thinking about everything except her. She grabbed his hand before he walked away and asked if she would have to wait long. He said no and pulled his hand back without looking at her again. Then he disappeared into the crowd. Minutes passed, then more. She kept standing in the same spot because he had told her not to move. People rushed by without noticing her. The noise of the crowd grew louder and the hallway emptied and refilled several times, but he still didn't return. She waited almost 3 hours before he finally came back. He didn't ask if she was scared or cold. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply told her it was time to go inside. It honestly felt like a cruel lesson in how little space she was allowed to take at 11. Something even more devastating happened. She walked past her father's study and heard him speaking to a producer. She stopped only because she heard her name. He said she was too soft for this business, not with worry or concern, but with a tone that suggested he had already decided she would never be enough. She walked away before the conversation ended, pretending she had not heard anything, but the words stayed with her. That same pattern resurfaced the moment Oprah turned away from her without a word. It reached straight into the part of her life where being overlooked had become a normal experience, even when she was only a child. Anjelica Huston spent her childhood moving between her family's estate in Santa Monica and long stretches in Ireland, where she lived with her mother, Enrica Soma, when her parents were separated. Ireland should have felt like a refuge, but it didn't. Her mother cared for her deeply but carried her own private struggles, and her father remained mostly absent due to filming around the world. Their instability left wide gaps in Anjelica's life. Staff members became the people who dressed her, fed her, and watched over her more consistently than either parent ever. School provided no escape in Ireland. She entered a strict boarding school where she quickly became an outsider. She was taller than the other girls, thinner than most, and carried herself with a seriousness that made her an easy target. Girls made comments about her appearance. Teachers treated her as if she were older than she was. Some called her intimidating, a word she didn't even understand at the time. She drifted toward quiet spaces, often sitting alone, instead of risking another hostile interaction. Her father visited rarely, but when he did, his presence created more pressure than comfort. He invited directors and actors to dinner whenever he was home, and she sat at the table, trying to blend into the background. Once during a dinner with his colleagues, he introduced her as awkward but honest, and the table laughed in a way that made her chest tighten. Another time he compared her unfavorably to actresses he had cast, saying they knew how to hold a room, a skill he claimed she lacked entirely. Praise came only when she stayed silent or behaved exactly the way he expected. Anything more was seen as a burden, anything less was a flaw. Then came the moment that showed her exactly how much control he intended to keep. Word spread through her school that a new film adaptation of Romeo and Juliet was being cast, and they were searching for their Juliet among the students. It was the first time Anjelica had wanted something for herself without asking anyone's permission. She didn't tell him. She didn't need to. He found out anyway. He didn't pull her aside gently. He came at her hard voice, raised finger pointed, telling her she had no business auditioning for anything without his approval. Greater than, if she was going to act, it would be under his direction and no one else's. Full stop. She stood there and took it. No Juliet, no audition, no choice, just his voice filling the room and her standing perfectly still, waiting for it to end. He hadn't just closed a door, he had made clear that none of the doors in her life were hers to open. They all belonged to him. At 14, the stress of living under this constant pressure began to show. She started smoking because it gave her a moment to breathe without anyone telling her she was too quiet, too tense, or too emotional. By 17, the cracks in her life widened. Late one night, a family friend knocked on her door in the dark. She woke up, confused, still half asleep, and the moment she saw the expression on his face, something in her stomach dropped before he even opened his mouth. Her mother, Enrica Soma, was gone. A car crash in France. She was only 39 years old. There was no one else to go, so Anjelica was the one who walked into that hospital, followed a stranger down a corridor and stood in a cold room, identifying her mother's body. She was completely alone at that moment. Her father returned from filming just days later, made arrangements, attended the necessary meetings, and then went straight back to work. No one suggested grief counseling. No one asked what she needed. She learned that pain was something she had to carry alone. During those same years, Oprah Winfrey was growing up in rural Mississippi and facing hardships that left deep marks on her life. She lived in a small house on her grandmother's property with no indoor plumbing, and she started each day by carrying heavy buckets of water from the well before she even ate breakfast. Her grandmother made her read Bible verses out loud every day and corrected her speech until she got every word right. Money was so scarce that Oprah often wore dresses made from potato sacks, and children at school laughed at her for it. She also faced abuse and constant moves between unstable homes, but her grandmother's strict rules gave her a sense of order that she didn't get anywhere else. At school, teachers noticed she had a strong voice when she stood up to speak, and they pushed her to enter local speaking events. By 17, she won the Miss Black Tennessee pageant. The applause she heard that night was different from anything she had known before. It was the first time she felt the world respond to her with pride instead of pity or dismissal. It didn't erase the pain she carried, but it gave her a glimpse of the future she might reach if she kept fighting her way through the life she had survived up to that point. This created a stark contrast. Oprah received affirmation through performance and strength. Anjelica received distance no matter how well she behaved or how hard she tried. These differences shaped how each woman entered adulthood. They both learned how to survive overwhelming pressure, but the lessons were not the same. Oprah learned to command rooms. Anjelica learned to shrink inside them. And that difference would matter later in ways neither of them could have predicted. Exploitation, humiliation, near collapse. Anjelica Huston entered Hollywood in the 1970s with hope she barely voiced, but the industry pushed back hard from the moment she stepped in. Her first major role came in 1970 when she appeared in A Walk with Love and Death. She was young, nervous, and trying to find her footing. I will think about you on your journey. Perhaps I shall say a prayer for your safe. Her debut had already been torn apart by critics, but nothing prepared her for what came next. Then came the audition that stripped whatever was left of her confidence down to the bone. She walked into the room to read For the Last Tycoon, directed by Elia Kazan, one of the most powerful directors in Hollywood history. She had prepared. She was ready. Kazan looked at her, let a silence sit in the room long enough to make her uncomfortable, and then told her plainly that she didn't have the beauty the role required. He said it the way someone states a fact about weather. Then, as if offering her something generous, he pointed her toward a smaller role in the background, a consolation prize wrapped in casual cruelty. She took it. She stood in that room, nodded, and took it. Because what else do you do when a legend looks at your face and tells you it isn't enough? She went home that night and sat in the dark for a long time. Not crying, just sitting, absorbing what it feels like when the world confirms the exact thing your father spent your entire childhood making you believe. Her personal life offered no relief. In the mid-1970s, her relationship with Jack Nicholson began. She loved him deeply, but the relationship came with humiliation she could not avoid. Nicholson's affairs were never quiet, Paparazzi caught him leaving other women's homes, and tabloids printed the photos with headlines that made her stomach twist. Then came Ryan O'Neal. She met him during a stretch when her relationship with Nicholson was fraying at the edges. O'Neal was charming in the way that dangerous people often are, intense, attentive, and completely convincing. She later described him as living like two people inside one body. One version of him was warm, even tender. The other version turned violent over things so small they made no sense. A conversation that ran too long, a laugh that came at the wrong moment. A glance he decided meant something it didn't. The abuse didn't begin slowly. It arrived almost immediately beneath the surface of his charm, and then one night it broke through completely. They were at a party when she stepped away to speak with someone she knew from a previous film. She wasn't gone long. But when O'Neal found her standing in a small group, laughing at something someone had just said, he snapped. He crossed the room, took her by the arm hard enough to silence the people around them, and pulled her away from the group without a word. The moment they were out of earshot, he hit her open-handed across the face with enough force that her vision blurred and her ears rang. She didn't scream. She ran. She found a bathroom upstairs, pushed the door shut and pressed her back against it, her legs shaking underneath her. He followed. He knocked first, then knocked harder, then began pounding with both fists until the frame splintered and the door swung open. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shoved her against the wall, and screamed into her face about disrespect and humiliation while she stood completely still, afraid that any movement would make it worse. When he finally stopped, he walked out as if nothing had happened. She stayed in that bathroom alone, not crying, not moving, just standing there with the wall cold against her back, trying to understand how she had ended up inside this moment. When it was finally over and she was back in Los Angeles, she didn't call a lawyer or a friend or a therapist. She called her half-sister Allegra, who was 13 years old at the time, a child. And that 13-year-old said the one thing no adult in her life had managed to say: leave. So she did. While Anjelica fought through rejection and violence, Oprah Winfrey was rising fast. Between 1976 and 1984, Oprah moved from a Baltimore news anchor to the host of AM Chicago. Within months, her ratings surged. By 1984, she held the top daytime show in Chicago. Viewers connected with her warmth, her humor, and the way she made every person she interviewed feel seen. She offered comfort through the screen, something critics often said Anjelica lacked. Privately, the comparison affected her. She watched Oprah's interviews late at night, studying the ease in her voice and the trust in her eyes. She admired the emotional strength Oprah showed so naturally. In quiet moments, she wished she possessed even a piece of that confidence. It made her question what she was missing and why Hollywood seemed determined to shut her out. The pressure built until her body reacted. She began having panic attacks before auditions, sometimes so intense she couldn't breathe. Twice she told close friends she was quitting acting for good. There were weeks when she didn't leave her house at all. She kept the curtains closed and let days pass without speaking to anyone. When friends checked on her, they found a woman trying to hold herself together with fragile pieces that kept slipping apart. But what happened next would shatter what little was left of her spirit. In 1982 on Mulholland Drive, she was in the passenger seat. No seatbelt when the car drifted across the center line and struck an oncoming vehicle head-on. The force threw her forward instantly. Her face hit the windshield with enough impact to fracture her nose, split the skin across her cheekbone, and drive glass into the tissue beneath her eye. She woke up in Cedars-Sinai with her face wrapped in gauze and both eyes swollen nearly shut. Surgeons had spent hours reconstructing the bone structure around her cheek and nose, removing glass fragments and stitching the lacerations closed from the inside out. She remained in the hospital for nearly 2 weeks. Visitors came and went, but she remembered very little of what they said. What she remembered was lying completely still in the dark because any movement pulled at the stitches, staring at the ceiling tiles, and feeling something settle over her that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief. It was clarity, raw, unwelcome, and impossible to push away. The humiliation, rejection, emotional exhaustion, and accident left marks she carried into every room she entered. Then came the film that changed everything, and the night that would scar her more deeply than any rejection ever had. The wind that should have healed everything. When Anjelica Huston signed on to star in Prizzi's honor, playing Myros Prizzi, A sharp and calculating woman caught in the middle of a violent family power struggle, she knew the experience would test her. But she did not expect the emotional strain that came from working under the direction of her own father, John Huston. The film was shot in New York in 1984, and from the first week on set, the father-daughter tension was obvious to everyone watching. Crew members noticed how her posture changed whenever he walked by. She straightened her back, kept her voice controlled, and braced herself for the criticism she assumed was coming. Her father directed her with a level of intensity that startled the team. He didn't soften his tone even when the entire crew went quiet from discomfort. More than once he corrected her in front of everyone, telling her to start again as if she were a first-time actress instead of his own daughter. A crew member later said he treated her tougher than anyone else. It wasn't professional, it was personal. Each day she returned to set hoping he would look at her with approval even for a second. Most days he didn't, despite the emotional strain the film wrapped. And when Pritzi's Honor released in the summer of 1985, everything changed around her almost overnight. Critics praised her performance, calling it icy brilliance and a breakthrough that proves her depth. Reviewers who had dismissed her for years now wrote full columns about her presence and skill. For the first time in her career, her father publicly complimented her work. He told press outlets she had delivered a focused and intelligent performance, and although he said the words calmly, they hit her with a force she couldn't explain. She had chased that approval since childhood. Hearing it now filled her with a mix of relief and unease. While Anjelica was navigating this sudden shift, Oprah Winfrey was filming The Color Purple under the direction of Steven Spielberg. She played Sophia, a strong, outspoken woman who refused to bow to anyone. The role demanded emotional force and personal vulnerability, and it pushed Oprah into territory she had never experienced on camera before. She struggled with her weight during production and felt pressure from every direction from Hollywood, from the expectations tied to the character and from her own fear of failing in her first major film. The shoot was long, draining, and emotionally heavy, yet the cast bonded closely, and Oprah's performance began to draw sympathy and admiration across the industry. She was becoming a national figure, someone people rooted for. By the end of 1985, the paths of both women were set. Anjelica's unexpected critical breakthrough and Oprah's widely praised debut placed them on a collision course. Their names appeared side by side for these movies in early awards predictions. Observers called the upcoming Best Supporting Actress race one of the most meaningful Oscar categories of the season. On March 24th, 1986, inside the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, the presenter opened the envelope for Best Supporting Actress. The room went quiet. Then her name cut through the silence: Anjelica Huston. She had just won against Oprah. Anjelica didn't stop for photographers. She didn't pause for the press. She didn't turn toward the cameras the way winners are supposed to. She ran straight back to her father, the man who had directed her with cold precision and corrected her in front of crews without flinching, the man who had blocked her first audition, compared her unfavorably to other actresses. That man was standing there with tears streaming down his face. She threw her arms around him and held on. No words were adequate for what that moment contained. Decades of distance of waiting for him to look at her the way he was looking at her right now collapsed into a single embrace in the middle of a room full of people who had no idea what they were witnessing. She had won an Academy Award, but what she was really holding on to in that moment had nothing to do with the statue in her hand. Anjelica Huston for Pritzi's Honor. Wow, I'm in shock. Thank you so much. It was the look on his face, the one she had been waiting for since she was 7 years old, standing alone in a hallway at a film premiere, watching him disappear into a crowd. Then she walked into the after-party, and the night turned into something else entirely. The Oscars night. The Beverly Hilton where the party took place was loud and bright and full of people. Anjelica walked in, still carrying the warmth of her father's embrace, the Oscar in both hands, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel it. The win, the validation, the years of endurance finally landing somewhere solid. That feeling lasted less than an hour. At the awards dinner, Anjelica was placed at a central table with Nicholson. producers and select cast members from Prizzy's honor. To her right sat actors who congratulated her warmly, while to her left were people who offered quick smiles but avoided conversation. Across the room she saw familiar faces watching her. Some looked pleased, others looked disappointed. She understood that attention could shift quickly in Hollywood, but the change in energy was sharper than usual. It felt like her victory unsettled people who expected a different outcome. Oprah Winfrey sat several tables away, positioned near Steven Spielberg, Quincy Jones, and the Color Purple team. The distance between the two women was not large, but the invisible divide between their groups felt wide. Oprah's section was crowded with guests pushing in to greet her, shaking hands, taking photos, laughing and talking over one another. Anjelica's table was calmer, the conversation softer and more controlled. As the dinner progressed, Jack Nicholson watched the room closely. His protective streak surfaced whenever someone spoke to Anjelica with a tone that felt dismissive. And there were several moments when he leaned in to block someone's comment or turn her attention away. At one point he muttered under his breath, irritated by how certain guests were treating her now that the award had been decided. Twice during the night, Anjelica tried to navigate the room to greet people she had worked with or respected. The crowd shifted around her, blocking her path or pulling others into quick conversations. Each time she moved toward Oprah's side of the ballroom, the cluster around that table tightened. Handlers moved in and out, forming a wall of bodies as they guided guests through. It was impossible to tell whether the timing was intentional or not, but it created a barrier she could not break through. At one point, overwhelmed by the noise and the pressure in her chest, she slipped away from the ballroom and entered a bathroom near the back hall. The room was empty, lit with a harsh white glow. She placed the Oscar gently on the counter and stared at her reflection. Her hands were trembling. For several minutes she tried to steady her breathing. She was not sad, she was not angry. She was simply exhausted by the effort it took to hold herself together in a room full of people who seemed determined to make her feel uncertain about her own success. She picked up the Oscar, looked at it for a long moment, and walked back out. She had earned this. Nobody in that ballroom could take that away from her, but the night wasn't finished with her yet. The car ride home was almost completely silent. Jack lit a cigarette and drove without playing the radio. Anjelica held the Oscar on her lap and watched the city lights pass through the window. She felt both proud and strangely alone. Something had shifted, and she sensed that the night would not settle easily in her memory. The next morning, newspapers celebrated her win, but most headlines focused on Oprah's future, her performance, and the direction of her growing career. Photos showed Oprah laughing with Spielberg at the after-party, surrounded by people who treated her like she was already an icon. Anjelica's image appeared smaller, tucked into side columns. The woman who had just won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress was a footnote in her own victory. The cruelest part, the shocking incident where Oprah seemed to ignore Anjelica, came at the end of the night in a moment she would only talk about decades later. But the pain did not fade. It followed her into the years ahead, shaping how she trusted others, how she saw herself, and how she understood power. Decades of silence while Oprah built an empire. The years after the Oscars moved forward, but something inside Anjelica Huston did not. She continued working, taking roles that showed her range and control. She stepped into The Witches as the Grand High Witch, and later became a household name again through The Addams Family and its sequel. The success was real and the work was steady, but she described those years as being lived behind glass, a feeling that never fully faded after the night she won her Oscar. She became more guarded in interviews and stopped attending most industry events unless she was required to be there. By the early 1990s, she entered therapy, trying to understand why a moment that should have been a turning point instead left a bruise she carried into every new chapter. Friends noticed she kept her distance even when her career was thriving. They invited her to parties, openings, or award shows, but she usually said no. She preferred quiet spaces, familiar company, and controlled environments where she didn't have to brace herself for being ignored or dismissed again. Then came the diagnosis that arrived quietly, but hit like a collapse. Doctors confirmed she had endometriosis, a condition that had been silently damaging her reproductive system for years. When they told her that becoming a mother was unlikely, she sat in the examination room for a long time after they left. She didn't cry immediately. She just sat there, turning the word unlikely over in her mind, trying to find a way to make it mean something other than what it meant. She had put motherhood aside during the Nicholson years because the relationship was too unstable to bring a child into. She had told herself there was still time. Now a doctor was telling her there wasn't. She pursued fertility treatments through the mid-1990s, showing up to appointments alone, hoping each time that something would be different. Nothing changed. She stopped going eventually, not because she had made peace with it, but because she couldn't keep absorbing the disappointment in that same sterile room month after month. It was a grief she carried privately, never discussed in interviews, never acknowledged publicly. The world saw her working, thriving, collecting acclaimed roles. Nobody saw what she was carrying home. What steadied her slowly and without drama was Robert Graham. The sculptor had entered her life quietly, and their relationship grew into something she hadn't experienced before, calm, consistent, and completely without performance. They married in 1992, and for the first time she stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. He didn't disappear. He didn't betray her. He simply stayed. For 15 years, he was the fixed point in a life that had known very little stillness. Then in 2007, he was diagnosed with a vascular condition that moved faster than anyone expected. Within 6 months, he was gone. She was at his bedside when it happened. She held his hand as his breathing slowed and then stopped. And then she sat in the same chair for a long time afterward because she didn't know where else to go. She was 61 years old, and she had finally found the love that had eluded her for decades, and now she was being asked to live without it. She never pursued another relationship after that, not because she gave up on love, but because what she had had with Robert didn't feel like something she could find again. She chose to keep it intact by not replacing it during those same years. Oprah Winfrey was rising at a pace few had ever seen. In 1986, The Oprah Winfrey Show entered national syndication and instantly changed the landscape of daytime television. By the mid-1990s, she was a billionaire. She launched Oh the Oprah magazine, founded OWN, built schools, funded charities, and eventually became a figure whose endorsement influenced presidential politics. Every year her reach grew larger. Every year she became harder to avoid. Anjelica avoided watching Oprah's interviews or appearances whenever she could. She once admitted privately that it was too painful, not out of resentment, but because the sight of her reminded her of that night. The memory didn't show up as anger. It showed up as a tightening in her chest, the same feeling she had carried through childhood when someone made her feel small without ever raising their voice. As the decades passed, the contrast became unmistakable. One woman built emotional distance to survive. The other built an emotional brand that touched millions. Their lives grew further apart, yet one silent moment between them stayed fixed in Anjelica's mind. At 74, she finally broke the silence. Anjelica's revelations about Oprah Winfrey. Anjelica finally opened up about Oprah Winfrey during a private event that close sources reported was held late last year. She described the Oscar as the defining moment of her career. She said that night was the moment I finally felt seen on my own terms. The win validated years of quiet endurance and personal struggle. When asked how it felt to win the award over Oprah's role in The Color Purple, Anjelica paused for a moment, then she spoke with quiet determination. She chose honesty. I don't think any comparison is needed, but it felt good to take home the prize. Before continuing, she finally addressed the part of the night she had never spoken about publicly. The moment she realized she was being ignored. She explained that when she walked into the after-party, she felt proud but also exposed, unsure of how people would react to her win. She saw Oprah in the room, surrounded by people celebrating her performance. Anjelica said she expected at least a glance or a small acknowledgement, but when her presence was dismissed without a word, something inside her sank. She said she felt a sharp drop in her chest, the kind you feel when you know you have been pushed aside on purpose. It was fast, she said. It was quiet, but I felt it fully. Anjelica then revealed what happened weeks later at a friend's party in Los Angeles. She explained that she approached Oprah again with cautious hope, thinking the first encounter might have been a misunderstanding. I told myself the room was crowded and the night was chaotic, she recalled. But that second time she saw me clearly. She laughed with someone else and turned away without hesitation. And in that moment the truth settled heavily. The distance was intentional. Anjelica admitted that the realization stayed with her for decades. I questioned myself for years, she confessed. I wondered whether I had imagined it or exaggerated it in my mind. With time, clarity replaced doubt. Even as Anjelica spoke about the pain, she also spoke of hope. She said that she still believed of Oprah, that had inspired millions. I believe the humbleness and compassion that endeared her to the world, especially to the poor and oppressed, is still there somewhere, she said. It has not disappeared. It may be hidden behind wealth and fame, but it is still inside her. Anjelica ended with words that made the room fall completely silent. I still admire what she built. She worked hard to be where she is today, and I will always respect her for that. She had carried the weight of that night for nearly 4 decades. Saying it out loud didn't erase it, but it finally gave it somewhere to rest.